Kia ora is actually the hospital I was born in Melbourne. And thank you very much, Alan, for the invitation. And also thank you to the Childhood and Research Network and the Social Futures Research Hub. Got that right? A wonderful place. I had a wander around Auckland yesterday and I'm enchanted. So thank you very much. So I'm going to, where's my, sorry, how do I, is it just here?
Oh, it's on there.
Oh, it's on here?
Should just probably do this. There you go. If you just move
The clicker?
the mouse, just move the mouse.
That.
Or if you just run that like that. Take that off. Sorry. So if you just move that.
Yep, got it. Okay, got it. All right, so here to talk about technology. So let's, and what I call the Great Transformation. Oh, a plug. This is based on a really great book called The Great Transformation, A History of Techno-Human Future, which is what I wrote last year, or the year before. It was published last year. So if anyone is interested, I've got some flyers there. So, so everybody does agree. I don't think there's much dissent that we're actually going through a major transformation. Sorry, what's going on? I've just, right, got it. But although people agree there's major change, they disagree about how this change can be best understood. And so there are a few different ways in which this change is talked about. And one of the ways in which it's talked about is what I call the sort of techno-determinist argument. And that is, whoops, sorry. So you see that when, for example, people say that technical innovation in America, or in the American economy, has forced Americans to adapt to changes in the workplace, da-di-da-da-da. Or when we describe technological change as a natural event, like a tsunami, or use wave metaphors, as in the current wave of AI-driven automation. Right, so the idea is that we are determined and our future will be determined by technology. And this feeds into what I call sort of techie boosterism, and the idea that inevitably this technology is going to drive us towards a new and wonderful utopia world where everything's going to be fine and wonderful, or to a dystopia, a very dark place. And if you've watched Black Mirror, you'll get some insights into that imaginary. So I've got a few problems with this approach, and I would say that technological determinism exists. The idea, or people who argue this say that technology exists independent of humans, and that is that it determines society, culture, and our practices, who we are. But in fact, technology is created and shaped by us, by humans, and is part of our culture. It is part of us. It comes from us, and thus it's subject to our control and our management. And so I argue against, and I warn against, the technological determinist account, because I think it's a fatalistic story that assumes that our future is governed by these sort of invisible laws. And it's not just technology. You see it with biological determinist arguments and history as well. But it's dangerous because it does overlook our capacity to imagine and to think about how we can build a new kind of society, new social arrangements that are based on what we think is desirable and according to what we think our particular needs are. And so another way in which the change is being described, which is quite popular, is that it's understood by this brain-computer analogy. You know, that our brain's like a computer, that our brains like software or computer software, and that it sort of expands out into particular networks like that. But the problem I have with this, like the brain is like a computer, is that it ignores a few problems, like the problem of consciousness, human consciousness, which is an amazing thing. It doesn't explain how or why we have phenomenological experiences, how sensations change into or create characteristics like smell or taste or colour or even emotions. People like our own David Chalmers will say that consciousness, is a wonderful quote from him, poses the most baffling problems in science of the mind. There is nothing that we know more intimately than conscious experience, but there is nothing that is harder to explain. And others like Restek, who would argue that if the brain is like a computer, then what is it like? What kind of model can we form in regard to its functioning? And the answer is, there is no answer to that question. There is no model for the brain, nor will there ever be, because the brain transcends all models. The brain's uniqueness stems from the fact that nowhere in the known universe is there anything even remotely resembling it. So I think that the sort of analogy between the brain and the computer is problematic. So how then, and I can go into other ways of people to explain the change then, how do we explain the change? Curious George. And I attempt to do that here quickly by asking a few questions, and they are, does human labour have a future? Does capitalism have a future? Just little questions. How do our leaders understand what's happening and how do they respond to it? Ask those questions and you'll get some insight into how we understand the change taking place. One way that I think is helpful and that I've used in that book is to draw on what's called a co-evolutionary study of human consciousness and technology. That means to look at the way over history we have made technology and how that technology has changed us, our consciousness, and in turn how we have evolved with technology, how our being and how our consciousness has changed. So explaining changes in terms of human consciousness, that is in terms of how we represent reality. So it's a co-evolutionary study where as technology changes, as we learn, for example, to write and to write books and to read and develop other kinds of technologies, how does that impact and affect our consciousness and our understanding of reality? And this means understanding our brains or our mind as embodied, unlike computers. And they're embodied in our body. And our bodies are connected linguistically through language, symbolically and socially, through those connections into culture. And they are then extended into outsourced memories and sense-making, and that evolves over time. I'll talk about what exactly that means in a minute. Now, to do that work, I draw on historical sociology. And I think it's really important to understand what's going on now. It helps a lot to understand some of the big changes that have happened in human history, historically. And the way in which it's helped me to look at long time frameworks of historical change is to go a long, long way back. And what I discovered when I looked at this particular time called the First Axial Age, I don't know how many people have heard of the First Axial Age, it happened 800 BC. But at that particular time, it was critical, and it took place over 500 or 600 years. We saw the birth of philosophy, the birth of ethics, theology. All the major religions came out almost simultaneously across Eurasia. We saw the birth of physics, astronomy, maths in places like China, Greece, Middle East and India. Right. That was a critical time in terms of changing the way in which we understood ourselves and our consciousness. And it was profound in terms of the way in which humans understood the world. It was pivotal in terms of our own human cognitive development, our spiritual and also our intellectual development. And it was when we started thinking theoretically. And that means, in academic language, recursively. It's when we started thinking about thinking. It's when we started reflecting on ourselves and reflecting on our thinking. And when we started taking critical thought seriously. So it radically changed this particular... What I argue then is that this helps us understand what's going on now, because I argue that what we're experiencing now is equivalent. In fact, it's more than equivalent. It's bigger than the first axial age, but it's that significant in terms of our human history. And so that's why I've called what we're experiencing now, I've given it a name, I've called it the new techno-axial age. You like that? And I call it that because we're radically changing our individual and collective selves, our culture and our consciousness. We're changing who we are. We're changing our capacity to think and be. We're changing the human condition. We're literally changing our minds and what it means to be human. And indeed the human condition. And we can see that when we think about the changes in certain sorts of human qualities and key events and situations that make up what it means to be human. We are seeing changes now like never before that we take for granted in conception, coming into the world, in birth, radically changed, in growing, how we develop emotionally, in terms of our cognitive capacity. It's just incredibly different to what it was 50 years, 100 years ago. In terms of our desire, in terms of illness, conflict, war, how we fight war with drones, etc. And even death. You know, some people are thinking that we can now defy death. So I argue that in terms of history, we're experiencing something as equivalent and significant as the first axial age. And it's happening because we are disembedding important aspects of human activity. That is, we're disembedding our intellectual self, physical, emotional, and consciousness. And we're reconfiguring them in algorithms and neural networks and relocating them into technologies and automated machines that are displacing and replacing various things that we have done. So in that way, we're transforming our biological and our physiological architecture and processes and our body itself. And in these ways, we're changing our consciousness, how we live in our bodies, how we work, and how we play. And to understand a bit more about what I'm talking about, I'd identify the key features of this. So first of all, we're outsourcing our memory into search engines. And that means, when you think about it, we can access an incredible amount of information and knowledge in ways we've never been able to do before. You know, we think about even 20, 50 years ago. You can get immediate information, may not be always reliable, but incredible information in a sort of a couple of seconds. Plus, you know, we've got robotic labour, and we've got decision-making capacities being put into algorithms and robotic processes. So that's one. Two, we're seeing changes in our consciousness and in our bodies. So new technologies and new rational and digital prostheses, for example, are changing our bodies, whether they're healthy or whether they're not, whether they're ill. We've got implants now that can physically strengthen us intellectually, our memory, and augment our bodies in ways that we've not ever been able to do before. Now, this is an important one as far as work is concerned, in my view. What we're seeing is the disembedding of consciousness, and that's it's rupturing a long-standing link between human consciousness, that is our imagination, and human labour, that is work, and other creative activities. Now, this matters. This matters incredibly for work and for the human condition. If we think about what Aristotle said. Now, he said, and others have said, work, human labour, is intelligent action, or intelligent action is characterised by human labour. And that is because we, humans, unlike other animals, elephants, beavers and all that, when they work or they labour, we conceive or we imagine the artefact before we actually make it or realise it in material form. So if we are disembedding that capacity and automating that capacity, we're changing the fundamental way or understanding of work and what it means to be human. And that means work, not just work in terms of getting an income, but the idea of work as intelligent action. We're seeing certainly a revolution, we're seeing a change in the nature of reality, how we understand reality, and human consciousness. Now, what that actually means is, I don't know. I think it's too early to tell. Too soon to say what a new consciousness might represent or reality, what it might say. But what is clear, I would argue, is that the speed of the coevolution that we're experiencing now remember when I talked about coevolution between our mind, our consciousness and technology, they're both evolving in a co-evolutionary way, is that we're seeing the outsourcing of that. You know, historically it happened with books and through typewriters. We're seeing it being done now in a much faster and deeper way, certainly than what happened with the axial age. And this raises, in my view, the prospect that we're revising what some people have called the master-servant logic that's informed the traditional age relationship between technology and humans. That is, that historically, people say we use technology. Some people say now technology is using us. So I hear that all the time, that we're being governed by technology. But this can only happen if we forget that it's humans who designed, invented, and who engage with technology for specific purposes. And we often forget that when we say, you know, that perhaps technology is ruling us or that it's driving us. And for these reasons, I say it's critical that we keep thinking and encourage the use of memory to encourage what we've forgotten. So another way we can understand what's going on is to ask whether human labour has a future. And in fact, does capitalist economy have a new future? These are not new questions. That guy up there, he's written about it, and so have many others. So the implications for work. We all know, I think, that robotic processes are automating work, and we've seen an enormous loss in terms of the semi-skilled and low-grade and unskilled work in factories and manufacturing. You know, that's not news. It's enormous. Whether or not that's a good thing is an interesting question. We're also seeing changes in terms of the future of professions. These two fellows wrote a book, father and son, about the future of professions, and they focused on medicine, the way in which it's changing medicine in amazing ways. But it's not just medicine, it's education, as we know. It is law. It is all areas, all professions. Not one profession is not being touched. Whether or not it means loss of jobs or whether or not it means changes to the practices and the augmentation of certain kind of practices is an interesting question. So, to help answer those questions about the future of work, I'm going to look at 3 case studies. Well, actually not case studies, examples. that give us a hint. One is about surgery. One is to look at a particular phenomenon in Japan called Hatsune Miku, and the third one is to look at the question of financialisation or surveillance capital. I'll quickly go through these. Now, I don't think it's new to most people here to know that some of the practices that most highly skilled people have done, surgeons, are now being automated. Not just in terms of smart tissue automation robot processes that demonstrate that a robot can actually do technically a better job at suturing than a qualified surgeon with 20 years practice. But also some practices or some surgery, like prostate cancer now, is done through robotic surgery, and it's done as the first preference because it means less intervention and it's more likely to be successful. Now, this phenomenon, how many people have heard of this person? No, I hadn't either before I started looking at her. So she's Japan's world most famous pop star, and her songs have reached the top, or they did. I don't know that they still are now, but she's very popular in Japan. Now, I think she's a good example because she's an example of consumer-generated media that brings together a whole lot of people, that brings together professionals, composers, animators, artists, fans, and everybody come together and collaborate to build the content on the web. A Creative Commons in effect. And it exemplifies, I think this is really exciting because it does show us some of the wonderful things that we can actually do if there's the will, if there's a political will to do it, in terms of teaching, in terms of democracy and participation, and certainly youth participation. And we can see it in some cases, for example, with Wikipedia and YouTube. They're sort of more popular Western examples of that kind of collaborative work and the possibilities of that, where crowds of people come together and work collaboratively, not for pay usually, and work with people they don't know. So that's her, that's Miku, and she's got, you know, long curly hair, long blue hair and twiggy legs, and she has been, I think, developed, Yamaha developed it, and then others sort of added to that. So when she performs, and so all her music, herself, her persona, have been created through crowdsourcing. So, and the audience, it's different to most conventional audiences. There actually are concerts that people go to, and she's on stage, and the fans report feeling that they're celebrating their own success, they're seeing their own creativity, they're writing the lyrics, they're creating the music, and she becomes a platform that people can build on as a tool of connection and participation, comes alive. Now imagine what you could do with that in terms of deliberative practice, or if you're really serious about inclusive practice with young people, for example, or students and/or students. I won't go too much into the details of how that came about, but what we see with her, it's an example of the changing social relations between producers, who would normally be, when you produce, that would be one or two artists and then the people behind that who would back that. And consumers, that is the audience or the people that buy the records in the olden days, and the changing nature of capital. So I'll go on to the third case study, and this one relates to the question of, does the economy have a future, and what are the implications of that for work? So capitalism has always depended on unequal relationships and capital and wealth. What we've seen recently is an increase in what's called financialisation. Are people familiar with financialisation? So I'll try and explain in part. Financialisation and digital technology, when they come together, explains why the long-standing relationship between capital and labour is disappearing. All right, that relationship between capital, money and labour is disappearing because capital, money, can be made without labour, without workers, without human workers, and also without customers. Now that sounds really weird, doesn't it? Like, how's that possible? And it's characterised by, or financialisation is characterised by the increasing importance of the financial markets, I think we're mostly familiar with, financial motives, institutions and elites in the operation of the economy, and also our governing institutions, how they've all been more or less financialised, and the priority has been given to sort of making capital, making money. It's not working. Oh, hang on. What's happening here? Next?
Yeah, do that.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, sorry. So one effect of financialisation, and here we have a thing that takes, at least when I started reading about it, did they have that wow effect, how can this be happening, is that we're seeing faltering productivity. With financialisation and technology, we're actually seeing what people call a productivity paradox and a reduction in the demand for labour. In spite of the promises of technology, information technology will create work, will create productivity. And so labour and productivity growth has actually slowed. And at the same time, we've seen the increased financial speculation and a reliance on digital technologies to make that happen. And this is linked to another key feature of financialisation, namely, and we all know about this, amazing increases in private and public debt. We've seen the growth of debt linked to what's called innovative practices, nice language, and the packaging of debt and risks that are connected to the provision of credit to low-income families and low-income people generally, or households, but not just low-income, middle as well. And part of this financialisation process is something that's called surveillance capital. Anyone familiar with this? Surveillance capital? Okay, so the owners of financial capital, it's a new form of capital. Sorry. Hang on, I just lost my mic. The owners of financial capital, like Facebook, for example, or Amazon, or Google, no longer need customers. Or at least customers as we've understood them historically, and they don't need workers. Users, that is us, who uses Facebook? Who uses Google? Amazon? Okay, most people in this room. Users like us are not the primary customers, even though we might think we are. The primary customers are actually the advertisers on Google and Facebook. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Its users are the source, that is us, are the source of raw data that becomes what's called this new capital, surveillance capital. So the revenue source for Facebook and Google, etc., is advertising. It's not us paying to do whatever we do. And other customers include companies like Cambridge Analytica, who perform data mining and political marketing for political parties. And they buy and use personal information from millions of people without our knowledge. And we know what they did with that, for example, in the United States. So surveillance capital is, unlike most forms of capital, traditional capital, because it doesn't rely primarily on labour. Labour is displaced by algorithms, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Those algorithms track the user's behaviour and analyses and predicts what they're going to do in the future, and then they sell it on to advertisers. For example, have you ever Googled you know, new shorts or runners or something like that and had a shop around, and then all of a sudden you find, oh, there are Bond underpants appearing on your screen, or Nike shoes or something. Okay, that's because this is what's happened. Your behaviour has been tracked. They're predicting that you might go back and check whether or not you're going to have a holiday in Surfers Paradise. They start bombing you with advertisements, and that's sold on. The other thing too is that companies like Facebook that are valued at billions of dollars employ hardly any people, especially when you compare it to the big, you know, equivalents of the industrial age, like, for example, General Motors, who were dominant in the 1950s, and they employed enormous numbers of people. Right. And this woman, Zuboff, is the one who's writing about surveillance capital, and if you're interested, I suggest you get her book. It's quite good. So we've got new kinds of capital in the form of Facebook and Google, who use the interactions with users to create surplus raw material for the fabrication of products aimed at market transactions with consumers, that is us. And that's created out of thin air, right? Zero marginal cost. And we're creating a new class of assets. So that's the new forms of capital that we're seeing that don't rely on customers and don't rely on human labour. So how are our leaders understanding what's going on? And how are they responding? In fact, who are our leaders, really? That picture says it all. How well are the governments and business leaders dealing with radical change? And I'd say, again, this is where history is important. How they're dealing with it is indicated by how the elites dealt with the crisis learnt from the past. How we dealt with smaller disruptions, for example, the 2008 Great Recession. And also, I'd say that the evidence points to what I'd call a willful blindness that's apparent in the actions that were brought about by that recession, and also the failed austerity policies that followed that. So our leaders are failing to learn from the previous crises. They're failing to recognise what's taking place and failing to provide effective policies. Not just the 2008 crisis, but the 1930s crisis and the 1890s crisis, economic crises. So I'd say that what we're experiencing, unfortunately, is a continuation of willful blindness, and that's because we can see our leaders, they're still failing to learn from that crisis. This is suggested by the persistence of the derivative markets, for example. Another way in which you can work out what the leaders are doing and whether or not they understand what's going on is to look at their language, and this is fascinating. What they say and how they describe the transformation. And what we see is a stockpile of metaphors and words that are themes that are coming out of neoliberal policy. Talk about human capital, more investment in education is the answer. And this is Obama, who said, if each American is to succeed, every American needs a relevant education and training so that they can secure a good paying job. Really? Okay, is the problem education? If we fix education and produce more graduates and reform education to make it more relevant to business, will that mean that all our graduates will be able to get jobs? No, it won't, because that's not the problem. The problem is that there are not enough jobs for the people who want them. Another lovely metaphor is that comes out now when our leaders talk about changes. Data is the new oil. Have you heard that? Data is the new oil. And we are moving into the fourth industrial revolution. Now, this I think is good for sleepyhead leaders, because it's lazy thinking, in my view, that we're just moving along in an evolutionary way from the first industrial revolution to the second, the third, the fourth. And this is what's happening. And just as oil revived and sustained the old industrial order and created work, data will simply secure the future of capitalism, create more jobs, and will go on as we have. And I don't think so. And we'll talk about why that might be the case tomorrow. You've heard of creative destruction. That's something that our leaders talk about a lot, and they would argue that this sustains a revolutionary process. This is not a new story. It's a really, really ancient story. It's about reincarnation. Actually, the economist Schumpeter, took it from sort of Asian mythology where they talked about, and religions talked about reincarnation. The historic figure of the innovator, the entrepreneur, is something we hear a lot of. And they are seen as the saviour, the superhero in popular culture. And that is everywhere in the minds of the leaders, many leaders we have now. And I'm critical of this because I think it encourages us to assume a neoliberal view of the self-made person, man, who dream up new innovations and breathe air into business and repower the capitalist energy. Because it's argued that creative destruction is a natural part of capitalism, that it's always kind of had this period of disequilibrium, and you just got to let that go, and then it will right itself. All right, and it will self-correct. That's part of the story, of the economic story that we have now, that we tell ourselves. Now, fast forward, many leaders say creative destruction offers a perfect account of how we have, with help of technologies, the capacity to constantly wreck and change whatever lay in our path and liberate and create space for new practices and business. All right, that's the story. Let's create change. Disruption's good because it clears the way and we can create something new. Another thing, I think it's the last one that I talk about what the leaders say or you see. They don't actually use this, but I call it the de Lampedusa principle. It's an old story. That if you want things to stay as they are, everything must change. I hear change so much in places where I go, like universities and government and hospitals. You know, change, change, change. But really, is it change? The best way to respond to seriously disruptive change that threatens political transformation is to make concessions to those who are opposing or who are proposing it, to appease and to diffuse the political energies and the emotions, to give concessions, but to placate and to appropriate some of the language, incorporate the opposition. And that paradoxically secures the old order. And this is an important point, by incorporating the critique, it actually directs attention away from a serious examination of the intellectual edifice, the architecture, the thinking that informs the neoclassical economic worldview that sustains how we see things. And why do they want that? Because such an examination of that edifice might reveal it's seriously flawed and it's not working, and indeed was and is the primary cause of the growing disaffection and the hardship and the disenchantment that people are experiencing. So change, yes, we'll incorporate change. Yes, we'll incorporate more transparency, but we will not seriously question the intellectual edifice that informs the neoclassical view of economics. So we see this de Lampedusa strategy of change but not change when we hear people talk about creative destruction, when we hear people talk about fourth industrial revolution, as if we're transitioning into a new industrial revolution, as we have. We're not, right? The change is much more than that. We hear it when we hear talk about the way in which we cover and we get the economy going and create jobs is to bolster the markets and to allow for the spirit of enterprise to flourish. And the market's actually the best way to diffuse the impending crisis. Deregulate, let the markets rip, and that will fix it all. And that's the reason why leaders are making some concessions towards democratisation, some concessions towards diffusing the anger, incorporating the rebelliousness, is to save the basic framework, the prevailing framework. Now, over, I would argue, the next 50 years or more, we're going to see an intensification of political struggles. It's a major change we're going through. It's not just happening now. It won't be over in 10 years. The intensification of political struggles over what the successor arrangements will be to the capitalist world order. And it will involve struggles between those who are orientated towards a more democratic system and those who are not. Right? That's what's happening now. That's what we're seeing on the streets in Hong Kong, in France, in the United States, in London, and Australia and New Zealand. So, in conclusion, it's one of my heroes. We need to do what the advocate for radical experimentation, Roberta Unger, describes as deep freedom. Now, freedom, that just doesn't, I don't mean do whatever you like, I mean positive freedom. What does it mean? What does it mean for government, business, education, and those who are interested in redesigning institutions rather than just pretending that we're engaging in change processes that ensure nothing actually changes? I mean, the next email I get about change processes in my university, I think I'll just go and cut that out of the recording. So he talks about deep freedom. Can we create a future in which as many people as possible can choose what they value and have the means to realise that? And so thrive by drawing on a conception of politics as deep freedom. Because you know what? We have the capacity now to produce everything we need in terms of our material needs. That's not a new thing. Bertrand Russell said that in the 1920s, and it's demonstrated now. We have the capacity to produce all the food, all the shelter that we need for every human. So Unger says, this involves assuming the responsibility for taking the opportunities that come with being alive at this particular moment, which is a critical, pivotal moment in human history. We have an opportunity and a responsibility, that's what positive freedom is, to imagine and create ways of working, production, and new social relations. So this means thinking seriously about design for a new techno-axial age, the new space we're in, a new imaginary to replace the liberal imaginary that now characterises all modern societies, and to take freedom seriously, that is, to recognise our human agency, our political agency, to recognise it and to act on it. To value plurality and dissent, because they are incredibly valued. That's where good ideas and alternatives come from, when you've got diversity and dissent, different ideas to what the dominant imaginary is. And we need an ethical inquiry. It's an ethical project as well. And to think about what actually is a good life. What is the end purpose of whatever action we engage in? What is the end purpose of designing an institution in this way? I would argue that the end purpose is to have a good life. What is a good life? A life in which we can flourish. And what does that mean? Conversation for tomorrow. In terms of, and also practical wisdom, the capacity to think and make good judgment, and public deliberation, which is critical for a democratic society. For education, it means a commitment to real inquiry, experimentation and practical wisdom that enables permanent creative innovation, dangerous things in schools, dangerous things in universities. So, what does all this mean for the future of work, and how will young people be different? I put those pictures up there because they're kind of symptomatic, or they signify what I think the options are, some of the options are. So you've got that little guy up there who's chained with his briefcase to the wall. So does the future mean liberation from 9-to-5 work? Does it mean other kinds of changes to work practices? Probably yes. Does it mean a breaking of the nexus between labour and income? Probably yes. Are there options for the creations of new kinds of work? Do we want work in the future? Why do we work? Do we work just for the money, for the income, or are there other reasons why we work? This raises questions about the work ethic. In the context in which we live, where we're facing a climate catastrophe, we need to think about that. And people are talking about the new Green Deal. Is there an opportunity, if there's a political will to create jobs, what kind of jobs should we be creating? More in manufacturing? More in being able to mitigate the problems in terms of the climate change? That fellow, then the second one, the next one's a picture of David Graeber, English, I think he's English, anthropologist. I think his work and his ideas are good because he talks about, since jobs have been disappearing, we've actually seen the creation of a whole lot of make-up jobs. He actually calls them bullshit jobs. And they're jobs that are demeaning and that actually create more work. So they're administrative jobs that don't do anything, that actually stop you from doing things, and people hate doing them. And he documents the creation of these kind of jobs. They create jobs and people feel virtuous because they've got jobs, but aren't they really the kinds of jobs that we want? And then the other picture there, I think, is important because it signifies that if we don't have jobs, then how then are people going to have money to buy things? Because that keeps the capitalist economy going, and we also need a distribution of goods, social goods, so that people can live well. And that raises the question of other things like what some people call a guaranteed adequate income, right? The idea that everybody universally gets income that guarantees you can live a basic, decent kind of life and not work, because we have the capacity now to do that. So there are some of the options that perhaps we will talk about tomorrow. And on that note, thank you very much.